O my letters, verily I say, immensely exalted is this day above the days of the apostles of old. Nay, immeasurable is the difference. You are the witnesses of the dawn of the promised day of God. You are the partakers of the mystic chalice of his revelation. Gird up the loins of endeavor and be mindful of the words of God as revealed in his book. Lo, the Lord thy God is come, and with him is the company of his angels arrayed before him. Purge your hearts of worldly desires, and let angelic virtues be your adorning. Strive that by your deeds you may bear witness to the truth of these words of God, and beware lest, by turning back, he may change you for another people, who not be your like, and who shall take from you the kingdom of God.
Thank you so much. So now I'll introduce our speaker for today, and just a reminder to save all your questions until after the talk when we have time for questions. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, you can fill out the Google form that I'll put in the chat. Our speaker this week is Mr. Edward Price, and his topic is Things You Didn't Know About. Price is a former atheist from a Jewish background who became a Baha'i 48 years ago. Edward has a bachelor's degree in psychology and religious studies and a master's degree in education. Edward was co-writer and producer of the first biographical film documentary on the life and teachings of the Báb, The Gate, Dawn of the Bahá'í Faith. Broadcast on ABC television, seen in over 500 venues, and presented in more than 20 countries, the film was also the recipient of the prestigious Wilbur Award from the Religion Communicators Council. Edward is the author of the Divine Curriculum books published by Calumet Editions. This series discusses the lives, teachings, and missions of the great divine educators, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, the Báb, and Bahá'u'lláh. Edward has published 3 books of this series so far, 1 on the general principles of progressive revelation and 2 on the Báb. Edward has also given presentations at the Parliament of World Religions in 2015 and 2018, at the Bahá'í House of Worship in Wilmette, Illinois, and at Baha'i schools in the US and overseas, and in academic settings. Edward continues to work on his book series. He lives in Wilmette, Illinois with his family and his Yorkie-Poo dog, Spy. And with that, I'll hand it off to Mr. Price.
Morning, everybody. How are you all today? It's still morning in the central time zone where I'm at, right in Wilmette. So I want to share with you some wonderful stories about the early period of Bábi history, early period of Baha'i history. And let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Okay, I was asked to say a few things about myself. Bayan already covered a couple of the points. I was born into a Jewish family, became an atheist at the age of 13. On my day of my bar mitzvah, I found the faith in September of '73, almost 50 years ago, at the University of Virginia. My degree was in psychology and religious studies. Later, I got a master's in education. And he's already mentioned my books in the film. So these are my 3 books and the film I worked on. And you can see links below if you're interested to pursue those further. My research on the Báb enabled me to learn things about him in the early period of Bábi history that are not widely known in the English-speaking Western world. This is especially true to the fact that while I was working on my books, I was introduced by my friend Behrad Majidi of St. Louis into the vast body of Baha'i scholarship that exists only in the Persian language. There is so much precious information to be found in these resources. In my 2 books on the Báb, we collaborated on bringing some of this information into the English-speaking world. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today is based on that collaboration. So I was asked to give a brief overview of the Baha'i Faith for those in the audience who are learning about the faith for the first time. This will help provide context for anyone in the audience who is new to the faith. This will be very fast and brief and to allow time for my main topic. So generally speaking, we can divide Baha'i history into certain periods based on who was the leader at the time. And you see from 1844, which is when the faith began, to 1850 was the ministry of the Báb. And that'll be the period that we'll be focusing on today. And you see from 1852 to 1892, we had the period of Bahá'u'lláh, period of 92 to 1921, the ministry of Abdul-Baha, 1921 to 1957, the ministry of Shoghi Effendi, and then to 1963, the stewardship of the hands of the cause. And then since 1963, the leadership of the faith has been in the hands of the Universal House of Justice, the elected world governing body of the Baha'i Faith. So in 1844, the movement began in Persia, which is Iran today, with the declaration of the Báb. He claimed to be an independent divine messenger foretold by prophecy, and also the forerunner of a divine educator yet to come. In 1863, Baha'u'lláh, who was a renowned follower of the Báb, announced that he was the divine messenger foretold by the Báb and of all the previous faiths in the world. These twin manifestations of God, their goal, their intention is to lead humanity to universal peace on the planet, inspired and guided by their revelations. So both of these divine educators were utterly extraordinarily and peerless among men. They rank alongside other great founders of the past, such as Abraham, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and so forth. They both attracted many thousands of followers, but the Shiite religious orthodoxy in the middle of the 19th century in Persia and the government of that day engaged in fierce and horrible, brutal persecution. Many thousands were slaughtered, but the young faith survived. Today, there are about 8 million Baha'is in the world. The faith is established as an authentic world religion, and followers reside in over 200 countries. For those learning about the faith for the first time, here are some basic Baha'i principles: the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, elimination of prejudice, the equality of women and men, universal education, the harmony of science and religion, international peace and the demilitarization of the planet, eliminating war, teaching of the highest ethical and moral standards, and so much more. And once again, the mission of the faith is, according to Baha'u'lláh and the Báb, is the spiritual rebirth of humanity and the unity of the human race. The goal is universal unity and peace, and the faith's watchword is unity in diversity, and all are welcome. So that is a very, very brief, very fast overview of the faith. And if you're new to learning about the faith and any of that piques your interest, by all means, this was just a scratching of the surface, and there is so much more to explore. And I would encourage you to do so. With that said, I'm going to move on to the main topic of today, which is things you didn't know about major events in the Bábi period. So here we go. One of the most interesting things about Shiraz, which is the place where the Báb was born, is that the glory of Shiraz as a place was foreseen many centuries before. The founder of Shiraz was living in the 7th century, and he was appointed by the ruling caliph of Islam at the time, and Caliph Marwan, in about 685 to 705 AD. Marvin's prime minister appointed his brother Muhammad ibn Yusuf Saqafi as the governor of the region. Saqafi had a dream one night, and he saw a group of heavenly angels descending to the earth. When they came to the land where Shiraz was located, they prostrated themselves and they said the following: "This is a land from which those who are imbued with virtues will arise. It will become the footsteps of holy personages. This is a place from which the wayfarers of the invisible divine worlds will benefit. It will be the focal point of guardianship, a leaven for those who are poor in God, the source of knowledge and wisdom, the inheritor of holiness and purity." So after having that dream, the next day he traveled to the region that he had been appointed as governor, and he saw the region and he recognized it from his dream. And that land appeared to him as full of light and dazzling brightness, just as he had seen in his dream. And he became confident and assured, and then he commanded architects and master builders to begin building the city. And that's a quote from the first of my books on the Báb. So the glory of Shiraz was foreseen far in advance. So here's another thing that we didn't know about early Bábi history. Turns out Mullah Hussein and the Báb knew of each other. So Nabil in the Nonbreakers seems to portray Mullah Hussein and the Báb as strangers when they met in Shiraz on May 22nd, 1844. They were not strangers. They actually knew each other. Nabil says Mullah Hussein met a youth of radiant countenance who wore a green turban and who, advancing towards him, greeted him with a smile of loving welcome. He says he overwhelmed me with expressions of affection and loving kindness. That's from page 52 of the Dawnbreakers. At that point in the story, the Báb is not identified by name. So Western readers, myself included, interpreted that to mean they were strangers to one another. The signs of affection were viewed as unusual if they didn't know each other. But I found out that they knew each other from the days when the Báb was in Karbala. So let me tell you the story of that. It turns out, oh, by the way, some of these images are taken from screenshots from the film The Gate, just to give credit to many of the images that I'm using today. Here we go. Volume 5, Part 1, page 60. Yes? Somebody say something? Okay. It turns out that during the period of time that the Báb was sojourning in Karbala and participating in the classes conducted by Sayyid Kazim, the Báb was invited to an event at Mullah Sadiq's home, who was one of the students of Sayyid Kazim. At that evening, Mullah Hussein was present, and he was actually the featured speaker of the event. And he was giving a talk that night about the trials and tribulations of the Imam Hussein, which is a great heroic figure in Shiite Islamic religion. And Mullah Hussein was reciting poetry about the martyrdom of the Imam Hussein. And as Mullah Hussein was reciting this poetry, the Báb was in the room. He was sitting in the room, and he was profoundly moved by the story that Mullah Hussein was telling. So during this recitation, the Báb began to weep in such a way that all those present began to weep as well. And so imagine the scene. Mullah Hussein is the featured speaker at the podium, so everybody knows who he is. And suddenly the center of attention shifts from Mullah Hussein to the Báb, and he's so overcome with emotion that he's weeping, and it's so profound that everyone in the room is weeping with him. So now everyone in the room has the Báb as the center of attention. So put yourself in that scenario. It's absolutely impossible that the Báb didn't know who Mullah Hussein was, and that Mullah Hussein hadn't become aware of the existence of the Báb. So the Báb made quite an impression that evening, and consequently, we know that they both knew of the existence of each other. So the question is, how do we know this information? Well, this information comes from a very famous Baha'i by the name of Ibn Astak, who was a hand of the cause of God, which is a high-ranking position in the Bahá'í Faith, appointed by Bahá'u'lláh, and he was the son of Mullah Sadiq. Remember that this event occurred at the home of Mullah Sadiq, and Mullah Sadiq himself was an eyewitness. Ibn Astak wrote his memoirs and included the story. Years later, at the home of Ibn Astak's daughter, the memoirs were shown to a scholar named Fuadi, and he published the account. And so we have this story today from Fuadi's book. And that's how we know, beyond any doubt really, that Mullah Hussein and the Báb actually were aware of each other. Of course, this does not mean that Mullah Hussein had any inkling at that stage that the Báb was the promised one, but it certainly means that he had an awareness of the Báb and there was some presence of mind there. So that's a little known fact about early Bábi history. So we have another interesting story, which is the miraculous speed of Mullah Hussein's journey to Tehran. As you all know, as the Baha'is are aware of, that after Mullah Hussein accepted the Báb, he told Mullah Hussein that they had to wait for other disciples to come and recognize him in the same fashion that he had done. And so altogether, there were 18 of these early disciples that are known as letters of the living. After these disciples gathered, each of the disciples was given a mission, and the mission of Mullah Hussein was to travel north from Shiraz to Tehran and onward from there to the east of Iran or Persia into the city of Mashhad. We know that in Tehran that Mullah Hussein found Baha'u'lláh and presented the message of the Báb to Baha'u'lláh, and this is how Baha'u'lláh becomes enrolled in the faith. But what has not been documented until now is the astounding nature of Mullah Hussein's journey. So we learned a few things from the Dawnbreakers and other Persian scholars who tell us much more, enabling us to estimate dates and times. And this enables us to put together a possible or a probable timeline of his journey. And we discover something amazing when we construct this timeline. So the Báb directed Mullah Hussein to go north and to stop in various cities along the way to teach the faith. and Esfahan and Kashan and Qom, and then ultimately to Tehran. So the Mullah Hussein had to spend a certain amount of time in each of these cities to teach the faith. For example, when he was in Esfahan, he met again with Mullah Sadiq, and this is how Mullah Sadiq becomes enrolled in the faith, one of the earliest believers also. And then there were other momentous encounters in Kashan and in Qom, and then in Tehran. So we are able to figure out, and this is documented in my book, we're able to figure out the approximate date that Mullah Hussein would have left Shiraz, the approximate date he would have arrived in Tehran, and the number of days we would need to subtract when he's not traveling because he's in one of these cities teaching the faith. Altogether, the computation comes to, he spends about 10 days walking 544 miles from Shiraz to Tehran. So we can put the numbers together based upon the various things, elements of dates and times that we have. So we can have an average speed on foot of Mullah Hussein of approximately 54.4 miles per day. And I'm gonna, page 114. Okay, so I'm gonna go to this. And I want to reflect on this speed that he undertook. Give me 1 second here. Go back, 133. Okay. So it's important to stress that these are hypothetical calculations. We don't know the dates for absolutely for certain, but still the idea of Mullah Hussein walking on foot 54 miles per day is pretty astounding. And so Mullah Hussein's speed of travel suggests that he must have pushed himself very, very hard on his travel days. The scholar Mehrab Khani states that he abandoned rest and sleep, traveling day and night. Mehrab Khani adds, if he maintained such a pace, he must have crossed extraordinary distances in far fewer days than normally required. This is not limited to a mere computation of multiplying speed times time. If Mullah Hussein actually walked at the calculated pace of 54.4 miles per day, how many hours per day would he have been actually walking? If he walked about an average human walking speed of 4.5, above average human walking speed of 4.5 miles per hour, he would have had to walk no less than 12 hours each day when he's walking between the cities. And this calculation does not include time for stopping for rest, prayers, water, eating, or relieving himself. And even if he could do it for one day, the idea that this frail man would not succumb to exhaustion, that he was able to maintain this pace day after day on what were probably dirty mountainous roads seems quite astounding. And then to think that when he arrived in a city after such a long trek, that he was fresh and ready to teach the faith with the vigor he obviously demonstrated appears to border on the miraculous. The loving dedication and the physical endurance required to achieve all this activity is most impressive. Candidly, it's hard to believe that it really happened, because Mullah Hussein in particular was known to be physically frail, tremulous, and possibly suffering with heart problems. Nevertheless, the facts speak for themselves. The mere fact that Mullah Hussein accomplished so many teaching victories overcame so much opposition and covered such vast distances in such a short period of time, exhibiting an apparent superhuman endurance, is surely a notable achievement in the annals of religious history and a testament to his indefatigable faith. So that's pretty amazing to consider the journey that he undertook in order to spread the faith. So it's also interesting to explore Mullah Sadiq's response to discovering the identity of the Promised One. So Mullah Sadiq was an elderly individual when he learned about the faith already. He was already an elderly individual. And after Karbala, Sayyid Kazim had instructed him to go to Karbala instructed him to go to Isfahan to prepare the way for the appearance of the Promised One. So he went to Isfahan and he became a leading preacher at the Shahar Bagh Mosque in Isfahan, and he had over 4,000 followers at the time. So on the morning after the momentous encounter with Mullah Hussein, and when he discovers the identity of the Báb, it turns out that Mullah Sadiq, he abandons his clerical attire. He puts on clothing suitable for a peasant, and he is observed walking at the outskirts of the city of Isfahan. A man by the name of Faraj, who was a friend of Mullah Sadiq, sees him there at the outskirts of Isfahan. And Faraj approaches him and says, "Why are you wearing these clothes?" And Mullah Sadiq answers, "I am going to Shiraz." "And for what reason?" And Mullah Sadiq replies, "A voice and a call has arisen there, and a personage has appeared who is claiming a high station. I am going there to investigate." So Faraj replies, "Why are you bothering yourself? Send a few of your trusted believers who can bring the news to you." Sadiq replies, "This is a matter of the verities of the faith and not for blind imitation that I can leave it to others. I have to discover the matter for myself." So Faraj says, "Then wait until I can arrange for you a horse, a servant, and some provisions." Mullah Sadiq replies, "This is doable. However, I want to walk this path of search by foot." Then he said goodbye, and he began to walk off into the distance. So Shiraz is about 280 miles south of Isfahan that Mullah Sadiq, an elderly man, was determined to undertake on foot. We know that he completed the journey safely because we hear of many of his exploits later in Shiraz, and he is noted in the faith for being one of the first believers to suffer persecution for the faith. And he lives a long life. He survives many dangerous periods, including Fort Tabarsi, and he eventually recognizes the station of Baha'u'lláh himself, and he lives a very, very long life, serving the faith till the end of his days. Okay, so that was a wonderful story about Mullah Sadiq. So after Mullah Hussein sends word of his achievements on his teaching journey to the Báb, who is in the city of Bushire at this point, in September of 1844. The Báb determines that it is time, as prophecy foretold, it is time for him to go to the city of Mecca on pilgrimage to proclaim his station as the promised one. The year 1844 was a very eventful year. There was quite a lot of discussion in the Shiite circles about the importance of the year 1260 on the Islamic calendar, which is what 1844 is on the Gregorian calendar. There was quite a lot of buzz and belief and conversation going on that 1260 could be the year when the promised one, the 12th Imam, the Qa'im, different names for the promised one, would appear. So the Báb decides to go to Mecca to proclaim himself as the promised one, and he takes Qudus with him, and he takes Mubarak, his servant, with him on this journey. So the Báb, the journey to Mecca itself is very eventful, and the Báb is teaching the faith all along the way. It starts out as a land journey from Shiraz to Bushire, which is a port city in the Persian Gulf, and he takes a boat all the way around the Arabian Peninsula, up through the Red Sea, falling on land, and then finally walking to Mecca, and then subsequently to Medina in further north in Arabia. But in Mecca, the Báb did in fact proclaim that he was the promised one. Now, when I was the writer of the Gate, I didn't have access to the information that I'm about to tell you. It is true that the Islamic leaders in Mecca ignored the Báb, but it is not true, I later discovered, that the Báb was ignored. So let me go to that on page 150 of my book. Okay. Whoops. So it turns out there were 70,000 people there, and they paid attention to him. So here is an excerpt from my book. And this is the 19th century equivalent of media buzz. The scholar, actually, Haji Abul Hassan Shirazi was one of the people that met the Báb on the journey, and he was in Mecca with the Báb and an eyewitness to the events. He said that the miracle was this, that despite all the crowd that was present, and that the noise they normally were making, that suddenly all became silent, to the degree that even a sparrow moved its wings, all would be able to hear it. After the silence of all who were present again, he repeated, "Indeed, I am that Qa'im for whom you have all been waiting." 3 times with the utmost clarity, he said this phrase so that all the pilgrims received it. And then the pilgrims began to translate and interpret this blessed phrase for each other. That is from the Persian scholar Faizi. So though his claims were not embraced by the multitude of pilgrims, many of them began to tell stories of this event. News began to spread to all regions that a young merchant of Shiraz, a Syed, 25 years of age, had taken hold of the Kaaba's door and claimed to be the promised one. Interestingly, these stories told by pilgrims returning home created what in modern terms, what would be called a local buzz. That is, since it was news, pilgrims would naturally tell their friends and family about what they had seen and heard in Mecca. It didn't matter if they believed the Báb's claim or not. It was interesting to talk about. It was fresh. It was uplifting, and it had an air of mystery to it. It was the talk of the town. The curiosity of many was piqued. In due course, actual teachers of the faith would arrive in the towns and start to teach. It was then that many people, already primed to be curious, would ask and receive answers to their questions. As a result, conversions to the young cause exploded. And that is the explanation of how the Báb engineered by his pilgrimage to Mecca the rapid explosion of the faith in Persia in the 1840s. So this is a map that I made with Behrad's collaboration on the initial expansion phase of the Bahá'í Faith, when he sent out the letters of a living throughout Persia. So they went from Shiraz and Bushehr throughout the whole country, stopping in all of the major cities, pretty much covering most of Persia. And as I mentioned, when the teachers arrived sometime between July and October of 1844, when the teachers arrived in these various towns, the people were already talking about this surprising event that had occurred in Mecca, and they were ready to listen, and the faith exploded as a result. That's how the Báb engineered the growth of the faith. Okay, so the Báb returns from pilgrimage, and there are many momentous events that occurred in the city of Shiraz after his return. Persecutions have begun. There's the opposition of the governor, Hussein Khan. There's the friendly support of the top religious leader known as the Imam Jumi. And then comes the cholera epidemic. And finally, the Báb is kicked out of Shiraz by Hussein Khan. And he is sent to Isfahan. When he is in Isfahan, he seeks out the interest of the governor of Isfahan, whose name was Manuchir Khan, and Manuchir Khan becomes a devotee of the Báb, and the Báb spends time in his palace. Is probably the only peaceful time that he had during his entire ministry. And towards the end of this period, Manuchir Khan is so overwhelmed and convinced of the superhuman knowledge of the Báb and his holy personality and godly qualities that Manuchir Khan offers all of his wealth to the Báb. But the Báb turns all of this wealth down. So it's an interesting question to ponder. What did the Báb actually turn down? So we're going to talk about that for a few seconds. Okay, first off, we have this from different sources, primarily from Mazinder Rani, who was a very noted Baha'i scholar who wrote 9 volumes on the faith, published only in Persian, not translated into English, but through Behrad's help, I have partial access to it. Anyway, let me tell you what Manushir Khan put on the table for the Báb. First of all, he was very close with Muhammad Shah, the king. And so he offered direct intercession on the Báb's behalf with the king. He promised that he would arrange for getting rid of his primary nemesis, Prime Minister Akasi. He would do away with the persecutions and overcome the corrupt and venal clergy at the time. He offered him his army. Manushir Khan had an army, and he offered the use of his army to conquer in the name of the cause. He offered to arrange a marriage of the Báb into the family of the Shah, and he offered to bestow upon the Báb all of his unimaginable wealth. Well, according to various sources, and including Sheikh Effendi, we actually have an estimate of how much money that Manushir Khan put on the table. And it appears that it was about 40 million francs in 1846. So I went to an online converter, historical online converter, and I determined how much gold 40 million francs in 1846 would be. And it comes to almost 11.5 million grams of gold, which converts to 403,453 ounces of gold. I checked the price of gold last night. It was $1,977.77. Just recently, for those who follow such things, gold has been recently poking above the price of $2,000 an ounce. But anyway, at today's price of $1,977, the 40 million francs would be worth in today's dollars $797,909,354. So Manushir Khan offered the Báb almost $1 billion. In its time, this was an unfathomable amount of wealth. And it is no question that that this is just an unimaginable amount of money. I'm not aware of any manifestation of God at any time in mankind's long recorded history ever to have been given access to this much power, influence, and disposable wealth being placed under his control. The Báb was not influenced by the size of the offer. He actually said, no, thank you. One of the Báb's spiritual teachings is the mystery of the great reversal. The Báb said it was not the will of God for the cause of God to prosper, to prosper through the influence of wealthy patrons or mighty armies, but rather it was God's will that the cause would triumph through the humble sacrifices of the poor and the lowly. So it's very, very interesting that Manushir Khan was emotionally very moved by this, and he radiantly acquiesced to the Báb's teaching. And the Báb also predicted that he didn't have long to live on earth anyway, that he was accepted as a follower of God's cause and would be rewarded in paradise. But he would not live long enough. Even if the Báb said yes, he would not live long enough to fulfill his intention. And the Báb told him that he only had 3 months and 9 days left to live. That calculates out to 93 days remaining. And as it turns out, that is just exactly how much longer Manushir Khan lived. He died at peace, but when the 3 months were over, he got a fever, and that was it. And he passed away. His wealth fell into the hands of his corrupt nephew, Gurgen Khan, and the wealth just vanished. So, but the Báb set the course of the faith, that it would not be through the donations of great patrons, but through the humble sacrifices of the poor and the weak that would raise up the cause of God. Okay, so this is something interesting. You might wonder, who is this man? Contrast between two men of Isfahan. So I want to tell you a quick story about the great-great-grandfather of Firuz Kazemzadeh. While we were filming The Gate, I was present when our very distinguished American Baha'i Firuz Kazemzadeh was being interviewed on camera. I'm sure many of you remember our dear Firuz, and he recently passed at the age of 92. When we filmed him, it was really one of his last interviews on camera that he ever gave. He told us during the interview that his great-great-grandfather had been brought into the faith by the Báb himself. And what happened was, this great-great-grandfather of Firuz Kazemzadeh was 15 years old at the time of the Báb's arrival in Isfahan. And his father, the great-great-grandfather's father, was opposed to the Bábi movement and didn't want his son to be interested in the faith. But he snuck out of the house and he went to one of the public meetings where the Báb was speaking. Manushir Khan was present, the clergy was present, and this 15-year-old boy walks into the meeting hall and he stands at the doorway because he can't figure out where he should go and sit. So the Báb sees him at the door and motions to him and tells him to come and sit beside him. So the great-great-grandfather, as Firuz told us the story, was brought into the faith by the Báb himself during those meetings in Isfahan. Meanwhile, a relative of the Báb was named Mirza Shirazi. Mirza Shirazi was a somewhat, not quite a distant relative, like a second cousin or something like that of the Báb. So he was actually part of the Báb's family. And it turns out in the 1860s to the 1880s, Mirza Shirazi rises in prominence and becomes the #1 Shiite cleric in all of Persia in that period of time. And he actually used his position to protect the faith, but he never outwardly becomes a Baha'i. It turns out that in later years, a nephew of the Báb by the name of Nuruddin obtains a private audience with Mirza Shirazi in his office in the city of Samarra, which is where he was headquartered. And because Nuruddin is a nephew of the Báb, they're both essentially members of the same extended family. Nuruddin pulls out of his desk a copy of his last will and testament and shows it to Nuruddin. And in this last will and testament, Mirza Shirazi testifies to his faith in both the Báb and Bahá'u'lláh at that point. And, but he never announced it. He never made it public. Anyway, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke about Mirza Shirazi in July of 1916. And so Mirza Shirazi, till the end of his time, did his utmost to support and protect the Baha'is from their enemies. And he actually ascended with complete certitude to the Abha kingdom. He passed on February 4th, 1895 in Samarra. His body was taken to Najaf. And in Abdu'l-Bahá's talk in July of 1916, he stated that Mirza Shirazi in his will had confessed his faith in this new cause. Nuruddin had seen it. However, after his passing, the family chose not to make it public. So both of these men took entirely different paths, but they both ended up as believers, one very publicly and one very privately. Okay, so this is interesting. How much and how rapidly did the Báb reveal the Word of God? So the Báb says he revealed 500,000 verses by his time in Ma'ku prison 4 years into his ministry. How much and how fast is that really? Well, the Quran is 6,236 verses. The Bible is 31,175 verses. Mathematically, this means the 500,000 verses that the Báb says he had revealed are equivalent to about 80 Qurans and 16 Bibles. However, keep in mind that Muhammad had 22 years to reveal the Quran, and the Báb had only 6 years, and only 4 years by Ma'ku when he makes the statement that he had already revealed 500,000. So doing the math, Muhammad revealed on average 283 verses per year, or 3/4 of a verse per day. Up to Ma'ku, the Báb on average revealed 125,000 verses per year, or 228.3 verses per day. To achieve this incredible pace during the amount of time he had, the Báb had to reveal verses 441 times faster on average than Muhammad did. Now, the reason this is relevant is because Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Bahá'í Faith, makes the statement that the Báb wielded the scepter of independent prophethood to a degree unrivaled by any of the messengers of the past. This is a statement from Shoghi Effendi. So you might wonder, well, what does it mean to wield the scepter of independent prophethood to a degree unrivaled by any of the messengers of the past? I'm going to suggest that the rate of speed of revelation of divine verses is perhaps one of these criteria. 441 times faster. And remember that the Báb is not revealing, the the gossip column in the New York Times or something like that. He's revealing the highest, most beautiful prose and poetry of the Persian and Arabic language on a par with the majesty and beauty and eloquence of the Quran itself. So anyway, in both cases, due to illness, traveling, or other physical constraints, there must have been some days when neither the Báb nor Muhammad would have been occupied in revealing verses. So it is important to emphasize these calculations are for average rates of production, and they're, of course, only estimates based upon the data points that we have. So this is very exciting. When I was working on my 2 books on the Báb, I was collaborating with Behrad Majidi, who was assisting me in translating from the Persian scholarly works into English. And many of the details I've told you today are the result of Behrad's translation work, and then my efforts to incorporate it into the books that I published. Well, one of the things that we discovered was that Nabil, the author of The Dawnbreakers, was disappointed and sorrowful about a particular point. This is what he says in the end of his chapter, where he discovers the struggle, when he discusses the struggle at Fort de Barcy. As to those believers who participated in that memorable siege and survived its tragic end, I have been thus far unable to ascertain in full either their names or their number. I have contented myself with a representative, though incomplete, list of the names of its martyrs, trusting that in the days to come, the valiant promoters of the faith will arise to fill this gap and will, by their research and industry, be able to remedy the imperfections of this altogether inadequate description of what must ever remain as one of the most moving episodes of modern times. As you know, we don't have time to go into the dramatic events that took place at Fort de Barcy. But this paragraph of Nabil that I just read is at the end of the chapter and at the end of the list of, he had 173 names. And Behrad and I, we found the names. Actually, a Persian scholar by the name of Khosravi found them in the 1960s. And we found Khosravi. Khosravi wrote 2 voluminous books, about 500 pages each, on just the events in Fort de Barcy. And Khosravi was able to surface and document 357 names. And so Behrad and I were unable to incorporate those names in the current publications that I have. So we're planning a new book on just recovering the names of the lost martyrs of Fort de Barcy, and just how joyful it will be when we will be able to report the names of all of the great heroes that sacrificed their lives at Fort de Barcy, who served the faith so valiantly at that incredible episode in Bábi history, and also the names of some of the villains of the story and the other participants of the events. And so we'll have a much more complete telling of the events. We'll know the names of the martyrs, what city they come from, where they died, what were pretty much the date of their death, the circumstances of their death, and any other biographical features about these individuals that we will be able to surface. And for some of these martyrs, Baccarat and I were only able to find like maybe 2 sentences worth, but others we found several pages worth of documentation on each one of these great heroic figures. So the future book to come will be entitled Recovering the Lost Names of the Heroes of Fort Tabarsi. Okay, this is the last of my examples for you of things you didn't know about the Bábi period. So we have an interesting question that we can ponder that I have not seen explored in any of our other English-speaking accounts of the events of the day of the martyrdom of the Báb. It turns out that if you examine the story of the martyrdom with a slightly critical eye, there are parts of the story that just don't make sense. For one thing, Sam Khan was a colonel in the king's army, and he had been presented with a lawful order from the prime minister, who was his superior, to execute the Báb. So there's no logical reason why Sam Khan would not have simply just followed orders like he had done 1,000 times before in his career. But he is very troubled that day, and his conscience is deeply disturbing him, and he decides to go and talk to the Báb at his prison cell. This, of course, is taking place in the city of Tabriz, at the barracks of this Barrack Square in the city of Tabriz. It's very, very strange that an army captain would go and seek out the advice and counsel of the person he is about to execute. So that is a little strange. On the other hand, the Báb had been vehement throughout his ministry that he did not want his followers to teach the faith by the use of miracles. He had gone so far as to say that anyone teaching the faith by miracles is devoid of the truth. He had said such a thing in the Bayan. So if the Báb was opposed to teaching the faith through miracles, not that miracles don't happen and not that he hadn't performed miracles, he just didn't want the faith to be promoted through miracles. So then why, as your last act on earth, would you go about performing a miracle? And of course, the miracle I'm referring to is that there was a firing squad of 750 soldiers aiming their muskets at point blank range at the Báb and the disciple Anis. And the first volley of bullets, when the smoke clears, do not kill the Báb. And the disciple Anis is standing there. Why do that? Why? There's no logical explanation for, no rational explanation for why 750 bullets at point blank range by an army regiment would fail to kill the Báb in the Barrack Square in Tabriz. So why perform a miracle as your last act on earth, an act that surely would be remembered, the Báb knew, for generations to come? So that's the dilemma. So I'm going to give you my theory on that. Now, Nabil points out that he says in Dawnbreakers that when Sam Khan goes to speak to the Báb, he says, "I am a Christian and I bear you no ill will." However, he's an officer in the army. Since when does his personal feelings impinge on an officer's duty to follow orders? Any disciplined officer in the army, any high-ranking official, would not take his personal feelings to his superior officer and disobey his orders. So it turns out that Behrad and I found out that before Sam Khan was a colonel in the army in Tabriz, he had been the chief of police in the city of Mashhad, which is all the way in eastern Persia. And it turns out, because this puts Sam Khan in Mashhad at the same time that Mullah Hussein and Qudus are very active teaching the faith in Mashhad. And it turns out that the prince, who is kind of like the leader of the city of Mashhad, was bothered by the powerful teaching events going on by the Babis, and he asked Sam Khan to intervene and to try to get the Babis to tone it down. So Sam Khan had direct encounters with Mullah Hussein, Qudus, and the other Babis. And his co-worker, the captain of the artillery of the chief of police, actually converted and became a Babi. So what this means is that before he came to Tabriz, Sam Khan knew the Babis personally, and he knew that they were not a rebellion, and he knew that they were actually very holy and spiritual people. And that's why that's why Sam Khan was troubled. And that's why he goes to the Báb seeking advice, because of his prior knowledge of the wonderfulness of the Báb, the saintliness of the Báb, the holiness of the Babi followers that he had personally encountered when he was chief of police in Mashhad. But this still doesn't explain why the Báb did what he did. We now understand, perhaps, that's my theory, we now understand why Sam Khan did what he did, but why did the Báb produce a miracle? Well, it turns out that in the spiritual teachings of the Báb, one of the highest ethical principles in the Báb's moral teachings, he says, do not be a cause of grief to anyone. Do not bring sorrow to other people. Instead, strive to bring them joy and to elevate them. This is actually the Báb's improvement on the golden rule. Not only according to the Báb are we supposed to do unto others as they would do unto us. We're supposed to not bring them joy, not bring them sorrow, but to bring them joy and to elevate them in any way that we can, if we can. So the Báb also says, whenever you undertake any action, to recite a verse that says, I do this for God. So the teaching of the Báb, whenever you do any action at all, is to center your motivations, that I'm doing this as an act of service to God. And hopefully, with that in mind, you'll only choose to do the most noble and worthy things. So the Báb was confronted with a choice that day. If he performed a miracle, it would become a central feature of his entire legacy and risk undoing the good accomplished by his teaching not to dwell on miracles. Or he could fail to live up to his own ethical standards about removing the sorrow of others. Here is a deeply troubled soul, Sam Khan, who was not even a follower, coming to him, praying to him as Lord, seeking to be relieved of a monstrous source of grief. The Báb had the means to lovingly answer Sam Khan's plea. A miracle was within his power. Which was more important at that moment in the mind of the Báb, avoiding a miracle or lovingly solving the terrible sorrow of a sincere soul? We know the answer the Báb gave to this question. He told Sam Khan, follow your instructions, and if your intention be sincere, the Almighty is surely able to relieve you from your perplexity. So we can presume that Sam Khan passed the test of if your intentions be sincere. As promised, God chose to answer the prayer of one sincere soul by giving him a miracle which relieved him of his perplexity. After the firing of the first volley and the Báb's survival of that first volley, Sam Khan was no longer perplexed. The Persian historical sources and the writings help us to investigate the motivations of both men. These two men, one of them a good and decent soldier doing his duty, the other a divine educator possessing infinite wisdom and compassion, were thrown together by historical circumstances. They responded to one another from a heartfelt place of love and sincerity. Together, they wrote the script of one of the most memorable, most documented, most instructive, and most dramatic episodes in all of humankind's religious history. The actions of both were for the sake of God. Outwardly, the last act of the Báb was a miracle. Inwardly, I believe its meaning was love. So that's my hypothesis. It's only a suggestion, it's only an opinion. You decide for yourself what you think. And so thank you. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the Bábi period of Baha'i history, and feel free to ask questions. And I'll now stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Price, for your talk. I learned so many stories that I hadn't heard before, so this is really great. I know I'm gonna go back and re-listen, and I'm sure others will too. So if anyone has a question, you can put it in the chat and I'll read it out. They'd like to know what you think about the explanation for the miracle that Nabil gave, which I'm not familiar with, but
I'm not aware of Nabil giving an explanation. He recounts the event, but to my knowledge, he didn't give an explanation. What does the questioner think is the explanation given by Nabil?
That the Báb had to finish a manuscript.
Well, sir, oh, okay, yes. That's a possibility. You could include that in the theory. But the question would be, is finishing a manuscript sufficient grounds to overturn your own teachings against promoting the faith through miracles? The Báb was very clear to his followers that they were not allowed to teach the faith through miracles. So in the motivations of the Báb, would, oh, I'm going to show I'm more powerful than you guys by completing my discussions with my secretary, be sufficient grounds to overthrow his teaching? Also, one would want to explore more closely the sequence of events. The question that I would ask, as I'm pretty sure that Sam Khan's approach to the Báb would have occurred first before the guard comes to take him away. Because earlier in the day, Sam Khan is deliberating upon whether or not he's going to follow orders, because he believes the Báb is a holy man and he doesn't want the wrath of God on his shoulders. He believes God will punish him if he kills the holy man. And his fear of God exceeds his fear of the prime minister, whose order he has in his hand. So he goes to the Báb earlier in the day, and the Báb assures him, follow your instructions, and if you are sincere, you will, God is capable of relieving you of your perplexity. So one can presume, hypothesize, none of us know the mind of the Báb. We're just trying to make some intelligent guessing about what we think might be true. But one can presume that after speaking with Sam Khan, that the Báb already knew what he was going to do when the guards came. So a little while later, then the Báb goes, then the guard comes, and the Báb already knows that he's going to spare Sam Khan his perplexity. So he is perfectly confident making a statement to the guard that nothing can stop me. And so in the end of the day, I would argue that the two accounts are compatible with one another. But ultimately, I think the motivation was he wanted to take care of the needs of a sincere soul that had come to him, essentially, effectively praying to his Lord, what should I do? And the Báb tells him what to do. That's how I would answer that.
Thank you.
Of course, no one knows for sure. It's just, an opinion.
We have another question that asks if we know what happened to those last words and manuscripts of the Báb during that time with the guard.
Say that again.
Do we know what the Báb's last words and what happened to those manuscripts?
I don't believe the issue was written that the Báb wasn't going back to his cell in order to finish writing a document. I believe from what I understand of the story, the instructions that he was given to his secretary, Syed Hassan, I believe was his name, were verbal instructions, not written instructions. And from what I have been able to glean from sources, Syed Hassan had been a faithful servant of the Báb through many years. He had been, it's a short ministry, but he had been with the Báb at Maku, he had experienced hardships with the Báb, and by his side, taken notes faithfully and so forth. Excuse me. And the Báb had made Syed Hassan a promise that Syed Hassan would live long enough to encounter him who God shall make manifest, namely Baha'u'lláh. And so Syed Hassan was probably giving instructions, the Báb was giving instructions to Syed Hassan to lay low, even giving him permission to recant his faith if required, in order that he would live long enough to meet Baha'u'lláh. And the historical sources say that the meeting did occur in the city of Karbala when Baha'u'lláh was exiled there in Karbala. Syed Hassan had taken up residence in Karbala, and then a year or two later, Baha'u'lláh had been exiled there. That was actually Baha'u'llah's first exile. And then in Karbala, the two men encounter one another and they spend a day together. And so Syed Hassan realizes that he is the one that the Báb said he would meet, and Syed Hassan recognizes the station of Baha'u'lláh. It's my understanding of it anyway.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have another question that asks, did the Báb and Baha'u'lláh ever meet?
They did not. In terms of physically, there's no indication that they met. Baha'is love to engage in wild speculation. There's a particular time when the Báb was en route from Isfahan heading north towards Tehran, and the Báb actually gets kind of playful with the soldiers, and in the middle of the night he leaves camp and goes off into the mountains surrounding the area and goes off to have prayers. And the soldiers wake up and find out that the Báb is missing. And there's this frantic looking for the Báb. And the Báb is nowhere to be found, and they can't find him, and they're looking and looking. And finally, a little while goes by and they see the Báb coming back towards them, coming from the northerly direction. And so, which would have been the direction of Tehran. And they were sort of in the outskirts of Tehran at the time of this situation. And so some Baha'is have speculated, well, maybe the Báb secretly met with Baha'u'lláh that night. But there's no evidence of that. So the best answer is that they did not meet each other in any sense physically while in this world. But of course, they both describe encountering each other through their spiritual world. And you and I are in no position to speculate what those meetings would have been like, but it's certainly reasonable to think that they were well aware of each other through spiritual communion, but we can't begin to guess what those encounters would have been like. Thank you.
Another question asks, was the fight between Tahirih and Qudus in Badasht real? I guess there was a fight between Tahirih.
You're breaking
and
up, but you're asking.
The question is asking about.
You're asking about the controversy that takes place at Badasht, and
yes,
yes, and the answer is yes and no. Qudus and Tahirih and Baha'u'lláh, according to no less than Abdul Baha himself, were meeting with one another every night. The conference lasted 22 days. And they were meeting together, collaborating a very important juncture, trying to navigate a very important juncture in the faith. The challenge that they were facing was, in Islamic tradition, it was believed that the promised Qaim would lead a holy war and overthrow the kingdom and restore so-called justice by the sword. And so there was a faction among the Babis at the time who were looking forward to the day when the Bab would give the go-ahead to launch this holy war. And so part of the Babi community, believing in the way the Islamic traditions had been transmitted to them, were expecting that this would become a military adventure, a violent military adventure. And the first move that they were talking about was to go to Maku and rescue the Bab. Had they chosen to do so, they certainly would have been able to pull it off militarily. They had the sources, they would have captured Maku by surprise, and they certainly could have accomplished it had they wanted to. The question was it wise for them to do so? There was another faction among the Babis that wanted to proclaim the advent of a new dispensation, that to fully disclose to everyone that the Bab was the promised Qaim. And they were not necessarily determined to undertake military activity, but there was controversy about whether it would or would not be military. So Bahá'u'lláh, Tahirih, and Qudus developed a stratagem. Actually, it was Tahirih's idea, and the men, Qudus and Bahá'u'lláh, embraced it, where she was going to engineer a confrontation and remove the veil to dramatically display the break with the past, the abrogation of the previous dispensation. And at the same time, Bahá'u'lláh was the mastermind guiding the Babi community inexorably towards being a strictly nonviolent movement. So at the end of the day, they were where the community was going, and the factions would be resolved on the following premises. Yes, Islam was abrogated. Yes, the Bab was the promised Qaim. No, there would be no military adventures sponsored by the Babis. And that was 1848, and that was a great turning point. And it really is the moment that the Babi and then the Bahá'í Faith charts a course away from Islam. It becomes an independent world religion, and it becomes the movement of world peace, the nonviolent movement of world peace that we know today. This is probably one of the most critical turning points in all of human history. So what happened was Qudus, Tahirih, and Bahá'u'lláh planned together that Qudus would be the spokesperson of the conservative viewpoint for the faction that held those viewpoints. Tahirih would be the spokesperson for the adventurous, forward-thinking, break with Islam faction, and that Bahá'u'lláh would be the reconciliation amongst them, setting them on the course of nonviolence. So it was a real dispute, but it wasn't personal, as we would later understand. As Nabil portrays it, it wasn't personal between Qudus and Tahirih. It was a drama that unfolded for the benefit of the Babis, and its purpose was to give all sides of the controversy their say in the argument, and to be led through consultation and wisdom towards the peaceful outcome that Baha'u'lláh from the beginning had in mind for the new faith. So it's complicated. That would be my answer to the question. By the way, I discussed this fully in my volume 5, part 2, my second book on the Báb. There's a whole chapter on this.
Thank you.
Good.
So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today, but
Okay.
I want to thank you again so much for your talk, and just all these stories are really, really nice to hear. I've never heard them before. So thank you again.
I hope everybody enjoyed it, and thank you so much for listening. And if anyone's curious, my books are available on Amazon. It was wonderful being with all of you today.
Yeah, we can put the link in the chat for that again too, for your books.
Great.
So our speaker next week is going to be Dr. John Woodall, and his topic is A Life Without Fear. And these talks occur every Saturday at noon Eastern time, so you can invite your friends and family. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list for these talks, you can fill out the Google form. Thank you for joining in, everyone. Hope to see you all next Saturday. Have a great week.